Whether you just bought a new camera or you're renting a camera that you've never used before, stop looking through all the settings, because there's only one question that you need to answer, which is, how do I get the right exposure? A lot of people are afraid to use the manual mode on their camera, and they just throw it in automatic and expect to get the best image out of it. So today we're going through the exposure triangle for cinematographers, how to use it, how to balance it, and more importantly, how to break it with intention. Let's get into it. Every camera usually has two main parts. You have your lens and the body. And even though there are thousands of settings, at the heart of each camera, there's only three things that truly affect your exposure, which is your ISO, your shutter speed, and your aperture. First, let's start with your ISO, which mainly affects your sensor and how sensitive the light it is. It is kind of equivalent to film stock if you were using it back in the day, or even today. If you were inside shooting, you would shoot on 500T or 500 tungsten. And if you were outside shooting, you would shoot on 250D. The number being the 500 or the 250 being the ISO, and the T and the D being tungsten and daylight, meaning how white balanced that film stock is. The number you would see more likely today denoted within your settings would be a range anywhere between 100 ISO all the way to, in most modern cameras, 256,000 ISO, which gets really bright. And again, this affects how sensitive your sensor is to light. The next thing that affects your exposure is this mechanical, what used to be a mechanical shutter, and you would kind of set how fast or slow it would open and close to determine how much light is reaching your sensor. This is usually denoted by fractions. It can go from 1/4000th of a second opening, which is extremely fast and you're barely letting any light in, all the way up to 1/2 a second. This is how it's usually denoted, which is basically the time that it takes for that sensor to open up and close to let light in. Aperture is the next and final piece of the puzzle of correctly exposing your image. So with aperture, you're controlling a mechanism called the iris, which is blades within your lens that are circular that open and close depending on where you have the setting. And how far open or closed depends on how much light you're letting through the shutter and to the sensor. This mechanism, unlike the other two, is not in the body of the camera, but it's mainly in the lenses. And it's usually right here in this like little center area. This is usually denoted by f-stop on most lenses, but once you get into like cinema glass, you'll see it denoted as a t-stop. The only difference between those two is that t-stop is a more accurate measurement of how much light you're actually letting into the sensor. So you'll usually see this denoted by f1.4 all the way up to usually f22. And when you're talking about cinema glass, you'll say t1.4 all the way up to t22. And like, again, this is usually where you'll see this affected. It's an iris in the center of your lens. So once you kind of have gotten these three elements, you've kind of can get to understand the basics of the exposure triangle. The three elements again are ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. On ISO, you have 100, let's say all the way up to 256,000, like we said. This is your darker side, and this is your lighter side. And then when you're talking about shutter speed, you have 1/4000th of a second. which is like extremely dark. And you also have, let's say, a half-second shutter, which is extremely bright because it's an extremely slow shutter, which means you're letting a lot of light reach that sensor. And then finally, aperture is from, I'm gonna say T1.4 because we're cinematographers. We use cinema glass. T1.4 all the way up to T22, which this is your brighter side and this is your darker side. This is basically your exposure triangle. So once you have these three elements on the triangle, you're able to have a visual representation of how each of these elements affects your exposure. So if you want more light in your image, or you want your image to be brighter, you'll raise your ISO, or you'll slow your shutter speed down, or you'll open up your aperture. But the important part comes in is what other thing these three things are affecting. And that will help you make a decision on which one you change in order to get the result that you want. So shutter speed, for instance, it affects how bright or dark your image is, but the trade-off is movement. So all that means is if you were to shoot something at a half second of a shutter speed, your image is going to be brighter, but it's also going to be blurry, or you're going to have like a ghosting effect. Or if you shoot at 1/4000th of a second, it's going to be darker, but your image is going to be frozen or jittery. It's going to have a jittery look because when the shutter is opening and closing, you're capturing light, but you're also capturing information. And the faster that it closes and opens, the more information that you're capturing. Therefore, you're able to stop the image wherever you want to and have the full amount of data from that image, versus when you have a half a second of a shutter, you have a brighter image, but you're capturing less information. So you have more of a blurry image. Now let's move on to ISO. Its trade-off is mostly noise. If you want to brighten your image to the highest possible ISO, you're going to have a high noise level. Versus if you bring it down all the way down here, you won't have as much brightness or sensitivity to light, but you're going to have a low noise level, meaning that your image won't be as distorted because it's trying to hunt for light. Essentially what happens here is that your sensor tries to hunt for as much light as possible, and when it can't find that light, it attempts to make up, I guess, that image itself, which causes the noise and causes your image to break apart. So now let's move on to aperture. Aperture affects depth of field. So when you're looking at aperture, you're affecting brightness, but you're also affecting how much of your background you want in focus. So if you want it to be a brighter image, that's cool, but you're going to have a very shallow depth of field, meaning you're not going to be able to see as much of the background. Or vice versa, if you want a darker image, you're also trading off the ability to have a shallow depth of field, so you're going to have a deep depth of field, meaning that you're going to be able to see all of the background and all of the things, the detail that's in the image behind the thing that's the point of interest. So when we're deciding how we want to move about changing our settings to correct our exposure, to get the correct exposure that we're looking for, we're asking ourselves the question, do we want to sacrifice having a shallow depth of field just to make the image darker? Or do we want to sacrifice the blurriness or the motion blur within our image to make it darker and freeze our image? When understanding these trade-offs and knowing that they do more than just brighten or darken the image, you're able to make a more educated decision about what you're trying to do, because maybe you do want to blur the image, or maybe you do want to have a deep depth of field and want to see the entire landscape. Knowing these things and knowing the answer to these questions is going to help you get to the exact exposure that you're looking for. So I know all of that sounds probably just extremely complicated and like it's too much information. But once you know that information, there's only 2 questions that you need to ask yourself when going into a shoot or prepping for a shoot. Number 1 being, how deep or shallow do you want your depth of field? And that's obviously your aperture. And your second question is, how do you want your motion or your movement to look? Do you want it to be frozen or do you want it to be blurred? And that's obviously your shutter speed. And of course, there's the reason why I say 2 is because it's pretty obvious that when it comes to how much noise you want to have in your image, the answer is always none. On most cameras, you want to have your ISO as low as possible so you have as little noise as possible in your image. For cameras, I know like the Sony a7S III or any of the Sony cameras, there's usually a dual native ISO. The native ISO of your camera is where your camera is supposed to be at to receive as little noise to no noise as possible. For the Sony a7S III, for instance, that's 640 and 12,800. Those are the levels where I receive no noise or as little noise as possible. Anything outside of these 2 ISOs is digitally adding light, meaning that it's hunting for light and is making it up with noise. So if I'm inside of a building, I'm most likely going to shoot at 12,800. It makes my sensor sensitive to light without having noise in the image because it's the second native ISO. Or if I'm outside, I'm going to shoot at 640 ISO because there's so much light coming out from the sun and from other sources, wherever it may have you. I don't need my sensor to be as sensitive to light. So I shoot at my second native ISO. This kind of reminds me again of the film stock when you're shooting in 500T or 250D. Whether you're shooting outside or inside, you make the decision of where you want your ISO to be or how sensitive you want your sensor to be to light. The reason why I say I only have 1 question to ask is because when it comes to movement or your shutter speed is supposed to be double your frame rate. So say you're shooting at 24 frames per second. Your shutter speed is going to most likely be 1/48, or for most cameras, they don't have 1/48, so it's going to be 1/50. Or if you're shooting at 30 frames per second, your shutter speed is going to be over 1/60. The reason why you're doubling your frame rate to get your shutter speed is so that you have the most natural motion blur. But as a creative, if you do want to blur the image, you know those shots where it's a person standing in the middle and not moving, the main subject is not moving, and you have these blurred subjects moving around, you'll slow your shutter speed down so that you can have that look. Or if it's an action scene or a wartime movie scene and you want to make it look jittery and like it's like going crazy, and then you'll speed up your shutter way past double your frame rate so that you can have these looks and creatively be able to make these decisions. I only change my depth of field or default to changing my depth of field for the most part, because most of the time in situations, if I don't have enough light, that means it's not a super professional shoot, and the client most of the time doesn't care about the depth of field. If they do, however, care about the depth of field, then we can make the decision in prep to have more light or have NDs so that I can keep my depth of field shallow or deep, and I have the control over how deep or shallow I want my depth of field to be. How I default between these is, number 1, I choose my ISO. So if I'm outside, I'm more than likely going to be shooting at 640, or if I'm inside, I'm going to be shooting at 12,800. Then I ask myself the question, how much flexibility do I have with lighting? If I'm inside and I shoot at 640 and the image is still too dark and I've maxed out my capabilities on lights, what I'm most likely going to do is go to 12,800 and then stop down my depth of field. And then if finally I've maxed out these two and there's nothing I can do and there's not going to be much movement in the image, like it's an interview or something, I'll probably make this a lot faster of a shutter speed, because most people don't recognize when the shutter speed is a little bit faster, just to get me at where I need to be in terms of my exposure. That's how the work is truly done. That's how people are able to walk onto set and just automatically know where their perfect exposure is. Of course, they use tools like false color or a spot meter, but for the most part, it's just about knowing these settings and knowing how your camera works and where it looks like at the perfect exposure. I know that it can be tough to shoot in manual mode and balance these three, but it's kind of like driving a manual car. Once you first get in there, the car shuts off every time you take your foot off the clutch too fast, or it is like clunky and it sticks. It's too much, honestly. The more you do it, at some point it clicks, and it's not something you have to think about anymore. It's second nature, and suddenly you're not just driving. You're controlling the ride. You're controlling what the vehicle does, and it becomes less like the vehicle is controlling your ride and more like it's just an extension of you. That's what being a cinematographer is. That's what manually exposing your image can help you do. It can make your camera less of a crutch and more of a tool to create your image and shape your image exactly how you want to. If this helps you in any way, like, subscribe, and share this video, because this is just the beginning of a long journey to getting back to the basics and becoming the cinematographer you want to be. Peace.